In this animation or video, we're going to look at and explore the functions of the kidney. Um, this animated picture right here, this cartoon picture, represents a kidney. Humans have two kidneys, and the function of the kidneys are to filter the blood, specifically to remove excess solutes, excess water, and waste from the blood. Here you can see two tubes from the circulatory system entering our kidney. Now we're zooming in on the kidney and looking at some microscale structures of the kidney. This tube here in tan, so all of this twistiness here coming down and around, and then a larger tube here, these are all components called a nephron. Nephrons have multiple components. They have this area here, which is called the Bowman's capsule. They have this area here called the convoluted tubule. There's actually two convoluted tubules. Convoluted just means twisted, so I guess you can see why that would be a fitting term. And then this area here called the loop of Henle. This convoluted tubule is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's before the loop of Henle. Proximal means before. And this is called the distal convoluted tubule because it comes after the loop of Henle. This larger tube, straight tube here, is what's called the collecting duct, and this is going to collect the final product, which will eventually become urine, which will collect into the middle of the kidney and then eventually into your bladder. So here we have zoomed in on a nephron. So all of this here in tan is our nephron. Here in red is actually our circulatory system. This is a tiny blood vessel called a capillary. And what's unique about this system is that the circulatory system and the excretory system, they run in parallel but in opposite directions. We call this counter current, meaning the current or the flow of the materials in the excretory system, called the filtrate, flow in the opposite direction of the bloodstream. So filtrate comes down as blood flows up this tube here. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch what happens to various molecules as they travel from the blood into the filtrate and through the nephron. So we're going to start with urea. Urea is our nitrogenous waste that comes from digestion of things like proteins. So urea, which is in our blood, we want to remove it. So if we click start, you can see the urea travels from the blood into the filtrate, through the convoluted tubule, down the loop of Henle, up the loop of Henle, through the next convoluted tubule, and out through the collecting duct. So we don't reabsorb any urea, which makes sense because the whole purpose of the kidney is to remove urea, this nitrogen waste, out of your bloodstream. Glucose, which is represented here by this yellow dot, glucose is something that we want to keep in our blood because glucose is an energy source for us. So if you watch, it's going to show the flow of glucose. So here's glucose here. So this is our input of the blood into the excretory system. Initially, we filter out the glucose into the filtrate, and then watch what happens here in this proximal convoluted tubule. That glucose is going to move from the filtrate, the liquid that's in the nephron, back into the blood. So there's our glucose into the filtrate, and now it's going to be reabsorbed back into the blood, traveling back through the blood and then back into our body. Okay, the next molecule we're going to look at is protein, and watch what goes on with the protein. Protein there in the blood, represented by green. It never entered the filtrate, it stayed in the blood the whole time. The reason for that, the reason why the protein never leaves the blood, is because protein is too large to be absorbed into the filtrate. Sodium, so salt, which is going to be represented by kind of a turquoise molecule. Watch what happens with the salt. Salt moves from the blood into the filtrate. Some of the salt goes back into the blood there, and the remainder of the salt stays in the filtrate. So in this particular case, if you've had an incredibly salty meal, some of the salt will be filtered out into your urine and removed from the body. So the excess salt or the excess sodium will be removed. And then the adequate amount of sodium that you do want to keep in the blood will be reabsorbed back into the blood. Same thing with water. Some of the water will remain in the filtrate and then be removed via the collecting duct in your urine, and some of that water will be reabsorbed. So let's follow our blue water molecule. So you can see water goes into the filtrate initially. Some of that water will go back into the blood. The excess water will continue through the filtrate, out the collecting duct, and into your urine. So now we're going to look at each component of our nephron individually. So we're going to start here in the renal capsule. The renal capsule is where we get interaction between the circulatory system. So see this little cluster of blood vessels? This is called the glomerulus, and it's going to be interacting with what's called the Bowman's capsule, which is the start of the excretory system. So in the renal capsule, this is where we have the excretory system, which is in tan, meeting with the circulatory system here, which is in red. So now we're inside of that renal capsule, and what you're looking at is up here is the bloodstream. Down here is going to be the start of the excretory system, the Bowman's capsule, the space inside. And what actually happens is, if we look at these molecules, if we look at the molecules here, what's going to be filtering out of our blood is going to be water, represented by the blue, glucose, represented in yellow, sodium in this turquoise color, and urea in kind of this burgundy color. What doesn't get removed from the blood are the actual blood cells themselves and protein, because they're just too large to pass through the membrane here. These other molecules, the water, the salt, the glucose, the urea, are just going to pass through the membrane from the blood vessel into the filtrate, which is the start of the excretory system, by simple diffusion. And you can watch that happen. Now, if we come a little bit further downstream from the beginning of the excretory system, the first thing we come to is what's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal meaning before, convoluted meaning twisty, tubule meaning tube. So if we take a look here, there's a lot of action going on. And we're going to pause for just a moment. So to give you reference where you are, this is a blood capillary, so this is circulatory system. Up here is part of the nephron, and this yellow stuff here is the filtrate, the materials that we initially remove from the blood. And then we can see our molecules again. So here's urea. Urea is just going to continue through the filtrate. It's not going to go back into the blood. But here we're going to see a little bit of water, all the glucose, and some salt are going to be reabsorbed into the blood. And the way that happens is, if you look, there's these little pink guys. So let's look at this one right here. These are transport proteins. So this particular transport protein is going to allow for the diffusion of water from the filtrate back into the blood. There's another water transporter down here, again allowing water to move from the filtrate back into the blood. So out of the excretory system and back into the circulatory system. Here we can see a transporter that's going to co-transport sodium and glucose. So sodium and glucose are being transported at the same time together, so the G and the Na. And then they're going to move that sodium and glucose from the filtrate into this cell here, which is the lining of the nephron. And then that glucose and that sodium are going to be transported by two separate transporters down below here. So from the cell into the blood, glucose is going to be passively diffused by facilitated diffusion. And then here, sodium is going to actually be actively pumped into the blood by a sodium-potassium pump. And if you take a look, you can actually see there's ATP providing the energy for the sodium to be pumped back into the blood. The next part we're going to look at is the loop of Henle. In the loop of Henle, we have what's called the descending limb and the ascending limb. And what's going on with that, we call this the descending limb because materials are moving down the limb. And we call this the ascending limb because materials are moving up. And the materials specifically that we're looking at are water, urea, and sodium. Notice there's no glucose anymore because all that glucose was reabsorbed in the previous section, the convoluted tubule. So you're going to see that urea is going to stay in the filtrate just like we want to, because really the big goal is to get rid of that nitrogen waste. But in the descending limb, we're going to see water is going to leave our loop of Henle, but salt's going to stay put. And this is because this tube is permeable to water, but impermeable to salt. Now going up the ascending limb is impermeable to water. So no water is going to leave the ascending limb, but there are sodium pumps all along the ascending limb that's going to be pumping salt out of the filtrate and back into the blood. Then the next part we need to look at is all the way over here, the collecting duct. This is the final part of the nephron. Materials that are left in the collecting duct will gather and become urine. So if we click on the collecting duct, what you're going to see is here's the capillary, the blood vessel carrying the blood, and here is the collecting duct. And in the collecting duct, we have filtrate containing urea, salt, and water. So the control of the collecting duct, the permeability of the collecting duct, is controlled by a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. When antidiuretic hormone is not present, when it's absent, all of the little transporters that would transport water or allow water to cross through the membrane are closed. So what's happening here is you drink a lot of water, you have too much water in your blood, so we want to remove the water from your body in the form of urine. So when ADH is not present, all the water transporters are closed, and water is going to stay in the filtrate, leaving the body as urine. Now, if you hadn't had too much or hadn't had anything to drink or you're becoming dehydrated, your body produces antidiuretic hormone. And what happens here, ADH actually causes the collecting duct to become permeable to water. So water is now going to go back into the blood and stay in the body as opposed to leaving the body as urine. So ADH is produced to help you reabsorb water back into your body. So ADH will be present when you are dehydrated and need to reabsorb water back into the blood. When you drink more water and you're nice and hydrated, you have plenty of water already in your blood, ADH stops being produced, those water transporters are going to close, and now that excess water is going to go into your urine and out of your body, and your urine becomes more dilute. I'm sure this has happened to you before, where you drink lots and lots and lots of water and it gets to the point where your urine is clear. That's because you are putting so much excess water into your urine that it dilutes the yellow urea waste. Then if you don't drink enough water, and I'm sure this has happened to you as well, your urine becomes this really dark yellow, almost the color of apple juice. And in that case, your body's going to start producing ADH so that your bloodstream will reabsorb water, pulling it out of the urine, and that's what causes the urine to be concentrated. There's far less water in your urine when you're dehydrated. When you're well hydrated, the water stays in the urine, and because the water's staying in the urine, your urine is more dilute and therefore lighter in color. And this is going to conclude our animation about the nephron.